So,
why did you show me this?
a viewer may ask.
Some Ranierge kept a journal about our travels. Should you find it, you will know. You can read, yes?
Here I come!
That's exactly why.
How does everyone get an education? What's the literacy rate in fantasy games like Skyrim, Arcanum, or VRChat? Some games do have answers to these questions, but in the other games we have reasons like
Uno.
because it is so close to our time and reality, and there is no reason to answer it. It's called low fantasy.
Low fantasy, or intrusion fantasy, is a subgenre of fantasy in which magical events intrude on an otherwise normal world. The term thus contrasts with high fantasy stories, which take place in fictional worlds that have their own set of rules and physical laws. So Harry Potter, American Gods, and most Marvel movies fall into low fantasy.
Dos.
The plot in the game does not mention the lives of ordinary people and only focuses on the main events of the game and or restricted to some locations. For example, war, space station, research facility, uninhabited planet, etc. And the most used answer?
Tres. We don't ask these questions here. Just grab this stick and smack this guy. Literacy is the foundation on which further human development can be built. By opening access to the book, it makes it possible to use the knowledge created by mankind. Albert Einstein. In small budget fantasy RPG games, this aspect of the world is simply not made. Yeah, there can be an RPG in which developers have made massive lore, so we can finally have schools. I think we need to make some rules before we start. Firstly, we should accept the fact that player characters are not normal people by definition, so they ought to know how to read and write, except if the player chooses to be dumb, like in Fallout 1, for example.
It's you again. Are you gonna get me out?
Cheeseburgers.
Anybody home? Could you get me out of here? Could you get me out of here?
And let's not assume that every beggar has no education, because everything could happen to them. Okay, let's start with a classic example. Dungeons & Dragons is the best known and best selling fantasy tabletop role-playing game in the US. D&D is a game driven by imagination. Shit, I don't even know what to say about D&D. The wiki only has this meme from 2000s. I know it's an ordinary medieval fantasy world and that's it. So, the Middle Ages. I'm not a historian, but I'm sure that it was a hell of a time. Education in the Middle Ages indirectly depended on the Christian Church, because it completely controlled this process. At that time, religion occupied a dominant place in human consciousness. It determined human behavior, regulated the way of life, and human relationships. This is the main key feature of medieval education. If in the 6th century there were schools of the ancient model, then in the 7th century they completely disappeared and were replaced by schools corresponding to the ideals of the church. From that moment on, education was increasingly monopolized by the Pope. Schools began to focus more on monasteries. During this period, only clerics were engaged in training, and they trained future clerics. But during the Carolingian Renaissance in Europe, an attempt was made to make education assemble to all segments of society. But after the death of Эр-Лэдэс, King of the Franks, from 768, also known as
Because Dickens?
this trend gradually recedes into the past. Schools were again concentrated at monasteries, and education was mainly received by clerics. But let's return to D&D. With full confidence, I will quote McCarroll from the EN World Forum. Unlike medieval Earth, D&D worlds are medieval for long periods of time. They do not progress industrially because magic serves the purpose of technological advancements or captures the minds of the dedicated individuals who will come up with the steam power, automobiles and the internet. So life does improve for even the unwashed masses in these worlds, although bottlers can't accept a vacuum cleaner to come along anytime soon. These improvements include education and in turn literacy. So basically, mages are the reason why everyone is stuck in Middle Ages. Bastards! We should keep them under control. Wait, that's Arcanum.
Are you blind? What in God's I mean, better luck next time.
We take place within a fantasy setting currently undergoing a transformation from its own industrial revolution, in which magic competes against technological gadgets. The story focuses on a Zeppelin crash survivor who wants to find out who attacked the vessel, ultimately discovering a plot by an ancient power to cause chaos. As you already understood, I mentioned this game in order to show off. To show the changes in society during the Industrial Revolution. As an example, I will take the statistics of the United Kingdom from the Victorian era, from 1837 to 1901. Education in Victorian England remained mostly for children from upper-class backgrounds. Most children did not attend school and went out to work and earn money for their families. However, as time passed, the people of the Victorian age were beginning to see the value in teaching their children to read and write. The Church of England began to encourage education in children so they would be able to read the Bible. As education grew in importance, various types of schools began to appear around England in hopes of furthering education. By 1900, approximately 40% of males and 60% of females in England and Wales were illiterate. By 1900, illiteracy for both sexes was dropped to approximately 3%. Thus, during the course of the century, there was an enormous expansion in the size of the reading public in Britain, giving new markets and audiences to publishers of books, periodicals and newspapers. So basically in Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, I could say that the literacy rate would be similar to Victorian England in 1870, around 80%. I'm not a professional historian, so this is just my estimate. Don't throw fireballs at me, please. Well, that was easy. Now let's go to another place and look at the Elder Scrolls series. Skyrim, Online and Daggerfall. I will not include Morrowind and Oblivion because I think there would have a small amount of information about education, and because I don't have these games. I'll use the information from the unofficial elderscrollspages.net. So I tried Daggerfall for the first time, but it wasn't very informative.
Oh fuck, it's a fucking bear! What the fuck? Ah, fuck, for fuck's sake. Oh, fuck.
According to the UEC.net, Daggerfall has 91 books, even though 2 of them, Arc-I, the God and Arc-I, the God of Birth and Death, are the German version and English version, both of which appear in English versions of the game. Okay, so the books from Daggerfall didn't have much information.
We ain't found shit!
The information there was mostly about politics, blah blah blah, Uriel Septim and so on. Yet I can assume that children learned mostly from their parents and also asked for help from more trained individuals. I decided to look at society through books, because through them you can understand people's culture. What could go wrong? Why not to talk to the people themselves, you ask? Well, they don't stand out in any way. They are generic folk in medieval clothes,
with a rather nasty nature.
Their phrases are informative in nature, without anything grand behind them. I have some notes. In dungeons, bandits, orcs and rats have 1 or 3 books in a single dungeon. Good for them. So I started reading books from Skyrim, Socializing, and I even bought a real book, Skyrim Chronicles. I know that it's volume 1 and there are more, but shh, I don't give a fuck. And you know what? I and my last brain cell found finally illiteracy. In the first book of the A Dance in Fire series written by Vaughan Yarth, right at the beginning of the book, there is a letter for the main character, Tikamus Scotty, from a fellow clerk.
By the poor penmanship, atrocious spelling and grammar, and overall unprofessional tone, it was manifestly evident who the writer was. Leodas Jorus. I
don't even realize that I had installed Hearts of Iron 4 with some ridiculous mods in which Deus, Empire and Disney character and bunnies were fighting against each other. God, I hope it's not them.
Deceiving foul thing.
Well, I got a little distracted. I just played it for a whole week.
I don't think
2
so.
weeks.
Not right.
A month and a half.
Yes.
Nothing special. So what about Tess Online? Oh no. Oh no. It feels like the population in the cities has become larger. Aristocrats, beggars, and here is 2000 level knight in absurdly colorful armor, running at the speed of the racing bolide. There are a lot of notes and books here. Oh my god, look, there's 100% literacy here. I think. Okay, not really. I'll talk about this later. I want to mention one situation, what happened to me. In Daggerfall, there are a couple of Dark Elf beggars. I assume that they spent their last savings on the trip from Morrowind to Daggerfall. But what for? It's a mystery. So what was I talking about? There are a lot of different notes, journals and reports, and most of them are in guilds. The easiest road to steady work. Assume that the majority of the population get their knowledge and works from here. Books are divided into collections, which vary greatly in size. And these collections are grouped into 3 larger libraries. Crafting motifs. This collection includes all the crafting motifs that were previously a part of eidetic memory. Don't have much importance, these books are short and contain little lore. Usually they tell the story of why weapons and armor were made in this style. Next. Shalidor's library is the collection of lore books that increase rank in the Mages Guild. In the Elder Scrolls Online, there are total of 297 books. Jesus Christ, maybe I shouldn't watch it all. Eidetic memory. This library lists most of the remaining books, letters and notes, not included in Shalidor's library. In the largest group, there are usually a lot of stories about personalities, warriors, reports, poems, memos, and a lot of other things. Okay, Andre Эр-Лэдэс here at the moment of reading. So I am reading the third group, Books of Blackwood, at the 34th book out of 118. If I am not mistaken, letter from Inalith. But that's not the point. Point is, it's getting ridiculous. Each group has an average of 100 books and records, some of which have nothing to do with lore, like, Oi, I am a Wookiee in the mine. I hope nothing bad happens to me. Oi, monsters, vampires, bandits. Oh, guess I'll die. I'm sure I'll burn out with these books. The only thing I found was one note by Lady Zircone, good deputy of Slack Town, and a remark location within the Brass Fortress where the tarnished, the unwanted population of Clockwork City reside. I need to point out that tarnished is the name given to citizens of Clockwork who have been cast out of society, unable to find a role, and have been essentially abandoned by the Clockwork Apostles, although they are provided the basic essentials of clothing, food and water. As the UESP.net says, I guess they don't have an education system there, and Lady Zircone's note is a proof.
Our gleaming city is filled with scholars, but do any of them think to come down to Ole Slag Town to help the poor, tarnished masses? Course not. Sometimes I help the little ones learn their letters between jobs. They're the only ones who give me the time of day. But I know soon they'll be off with jobs of their own, and they won't have time to listen to their dear old deputy natter on about vowels and verbs.
Although this is a case when there is a majority of the city illiterate, but this is an exception since everything happens in the dimension of clockwork mechanisms.
You understand mechanical hands, all the rumor of everything.
And also because it is an artificially limited society, and in Tamriel everything is not so obvious. But let's focus on the world of Skyrim, rather than all the rest of the other games, since it is the last one in the test timeline and the last main title in the series, which means that it has more reliable information. Of course, until a new game comes out and changes some parts.
Do you get to the Cloud District very often? Oh, what am I saying? Of course you don't.
It is difficult to say which era of our history can be compared to the fourth era in the history of TES. In this picture, the fourth era is compared with the era of the late Middle Ages, the period of European history lasting from AD 1250 to 1500, which is worth noting, is characterized by overcoming feudal fragmentation and the formation of centralized states in England and France. Using the financial resources of the cities, the kings could maintain a permanent mercenary army to fight rebellious feudal lords. Certain technological inventions of the period, whether of Arab or Chinese origin or unique European innovations, were to have a great influence on political and social developments, in particular gunpowder, the printing press. Anyway, well, something doesn't add up. Gunpowder.
Stop fucking lying!
Many factors lead to the fact that the era of quasi-antiquity is taking place in Skyrim, religion that is stable polytheism. Paved roads from antiquity, fortresses also from antiquity, have already been built since the Roman Empire. Naturally, considering a fantasy world in parallel with a real one is a thankless task in advance. The story may not turn out the way it should, not to mention the fact that the phenomenon of magic itself has a unique effect on the evolution of mankind and the development of technology, as I said at the beginning of the video. However, I am of the opinion that the world of TES in the fourth era is close to late antiquity, a period of transition between classical antiquity and the Middle Ages, in which much of the Greco-Roman heritage was lost. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire marked the beginning of the new era, the Middle Ages. The fourth era began without Emperor Tamriel on the throne, followed by the weakening of the Tamriel Empire, and as a result, the formation of independent states, the Aldmeri Dominion, Argonia, and the Redguard Kingdom of Hammerfell, as well as the revolts of the Stormcloaks in Skyrim. My god, everything seems to fit together! Yes, I am a genius! Whether it was, it's probably known to everyone already. The whole point was on the surface. For me, until that time, the Empire was just a formality, like all fantasy settings use these types of people, like Scandinavians, Roman Imperials, Egyptians, etc., without substituting any essence in them, just skins. Now that we can tell a specific time, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 467. For comparison, let's return to the topic of education. Ancient Roman society was hierarchical. Freeborn Roman citizens were divided into several classes, depending on their origin and property status. These were several other classes that were not citizens and had some legal rights, as well as slaves deprived of all rights. Citizenship is granted to upper-class patricians, as well as working-class plebeians and women. Non-citizens include freedmen, slaves, and non-Roman citizens. From this, it can be assumed that in this case, slaves could not receive education in Tamriel, although by the 4th era, slavery had already been outlawed throughout Tamriel. I will quote an article by Edward Watts in the collective work of the Oxford's Handbook of Late Antiquity. Here we go. In late antiquity, Pandeia, the common culture of the educated man, represented an universal culture currency that distinguished the cultivated from the average man through an expensive and time-consuming education that drilled students to follow linguistic rules and taught them to master a code of socially acceptable behavior. The Roman educational system had implanted a deep appreciation of the value of Pandeia among the urban elites of the Mediterranean world. Throughout the empire, men had come to assume that the educated man was better than his uneducated contemporaries. His learning guided his soul towards excellence and the condition proper to humanity, while his uneducated contemporaries languished in a less refined and more primitive state. Many devotees of Paideia saw their cultivation as so much of a defining feature of their elite identities that they highlighted it explicitly in epitaphs, public inscriptions, and the letters that they circulated and published. This sentiment rested on a solid foundation. Although fundamentally literary in character, later Roman education did as much to socialize students as it did to familiarize them with the works of a classical canon. Students learned about, commented on, and practiced the behaviors that marked one as a member of polite society. Paideia then created and sustained the reciprocal relationships and codes of conduct essential to the functioning of an elite social system that had spread across the Roman world. This chapter explores both the literary and social aspects of the late antique education. It begins by discussing, in general terms, the nature of teaching. Although some attention is paid to basic reading and writing instructions, most of the discussion focuses on elite literary education, the best documented and most influential teaching in the late antique world. Later Roman education, at its most accessible level, was not geared toward the literary training of Paideia. The vast majority of people in the Roman world were effectively illiterate.
and most young people probably received little formal education at all. Most of those people who did attend class received only a functional education, undertaken at a school of letters, in which they acquired basic literacy. If they completed their training, which undoubtedly most did not, these students could presumably read and/or write, but they would not possess any detailed familiarity with classical literature or the literacy style of famous authors. Additionally, many of the people who once possessed these skills were likely to forget some of them as their lives went on. Literacy is a skill that must be developed, but it is also one that must be practiced constantly, if it is not to be lost. Many average Romans who once possessed some degree of literacy would have seen these skills gradually atrophy through disuse. I think this will be the end of the quote. I guess you could read this article on the internet. You can read.
Fuck
yes. Yeah! Very interesting. But how will it fit Tamriel? I have no idea. I guess the world in Skyrim is not shown in full scale due to game conventions. Cities in size somehow reach the size of real villages, and therefore it depicts specific types of citizens. You can say the elite of the city and the ordinary poor and simply unnecessary people, to a great extent, were cut. Then what comes out of all this? What is the level of literacy in Skyrim? 100%? There are such single cases as Aventus Aretido, a 10-year-old boy Nord undertakes a successful attempt to contact the Dark Brotherhood by performing a black sacrament. So that means that at least he can read. After all, even bandits, the dregs of society, have access to books, write notes and diaries, and some can even cast spells, although perhaps not everyone. But this is at most 10% of illiterate population. About ancient Rome, so many years have passed that it is impossible to know with certainty the exact percentage of illiteracy in ancient Rome. It doesn't change anything anyway. It's hard to believe in illiteracy when literally everyone can read and write. We will have to accept that thought has killed 80% of the population, leaving only the literate people. I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I did making it. If not, then you could probably guess which part of it I didn't like making. The conclusion is simple. No one cares! No one cares to make such a fantasy game where we can fully see society without the population limit. It's just not profitable and rather time consuming. Wow. Like this video? Well, what did you expect from a YouTuber with 13 or 20 subscribers who rarely throws memes on the internet? This topic is not interesting to anyone at all, and if it was interesting to someone, then it will be 10 years ago on some old forum or on Reddit. However, you can write a comment about what I forgot to mention, let's say The Witcher 3. I was thinking of inserting this game into this video, but it will be too much. Also, you can point out my mistakes, which I don't have. In the meantime, this is where I get off.